Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on evolution, and specifically discussing the theory of evolution and Darwin's thought process. Let's get started on this next video. So the evolution of Darwin's theory, well, let's go through and make sure we review the definition for evolution and what we talked about the other day. Remember, it takes Darwin over 20 years to write The Origin of the Species, and the fundamental idea behind this is the theory of evolution, which is the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the Earth. Now, Darwin was influenced by a variety of different people, including individuals in his family, and we'll look at this in a separate video. But let's go through and look at Darwin's thought process. Now, Darwin was influenced by another individual named Lamarck. And like Darwin, Lamarck thought that species can change over time, and the fossil record helped convince Lamarck of that. And this influences Charles Darwin in his studies. Now, Lyell also goes through and influences Darwin. So from Lyell, Darwin saw the Earth and its life were very old. Thus, there had been enough time for evolution to occur and greater diversify life. Now, Darwin also got information from Malthus. And from Malthus, Darwin knew that populations could grow faster than their resources, and this overproduction of offspring led to a struggle for existence, in Darwin's words. So from these individuals, Darwin coined the term fitness and artificial selection to describe organisms' ability to survive and reproduce. And fitness, well, this is an organism's relative ability to survive and then produce fertile offspring. Now, in nature, offspring with certain variations might be more likely to survive the struggle for existence and therefore reproduce. Now, Wallace is another scientist at the time, and he helps back up his Darwin's idea with his publications. And we'll go through and look at all these individuals shortly. Now, before we go through and discuss evolution in a little bit more detail, what I'd like to do is simply go through and look at some giraffes. Now, giraffes are really interesting animals. And the giraffe is an African mammal, and it's actually the tallest living terrestrial animal that is currently roaming the Earth now. Now, the giraffe's chief distinguishing characteristics are its extremely long neck, and you can see that based on the images here. It also has very long legs. Now, it has these really interesting horn-like ossicones, and it also has this very distinctive coat pattern. Now, if we were to go through and go back to its closest extinct relative, that would be the okapi. And an okapi is really a forest giraffe, or a zebra giraffe is what it's called. Now, you can see giraffes scattered all over from Chad and north to South Africa. And you can see them ranging from Niger in the west to Somalia in the east. And what they're usually going to inhabit are savannas and woodlands. Now, their main food source is going to be the leaves and fruits and flowers of woody plants. And they're really going to browse at heights that most other herbivores cannot reach. So the question we must ask ourselves is, well, how did the giraffes eventually look the way that they did now? And this is really a result of evolution. So let's try to understand feeding behaviors of these giraffes and look at this cartoon to understand how over time the giraffes gain these longer necks. So the key concept here behind evolution is natural selection. And natural selection is this interesting concept that Darwin went through and really coined and brought to the forefront of science. So let's say we have these individual giraffes here on the left. Now, in the past, giraffes had short necks, but there was a chance of variation in neck length that could be due to a mutation. So some giraffes had necks that were a little bit longer than average due to mutations in their DNA and their genetics. And because of this, we can see this giraffe on the left, it has an advantage over the short giraffes. So, then, as now, giraffes fed on tree leaves. Perhaps the environment changed and the leaves became scarcer. Over time, there will be more giraffes than the trees could support, and therefore there is a struggle for existence. So over time, as the giraffes reproduce, there's too many of them. And eventually there's not enough leaves to support all the giraffes. So which giraffes are going to survive? Well, if we think about this, the shorter giraffes are not going to have the advantage that the taller giraffes have, because the taller giraffes can reach the leaves that the shorter giraffes can grab, but also the leaves at the top of the tree. They're going to be able to get more food. They're also going to have more resources to go through and reproduce and create more offspring. So we can see that these shorter giraffes are no longer going to exist. So let's look at this middle scenario here. Another thing that we can think about is maybe the environment goes through and changes here. So again, if we're looking at the struggle for existence, let's say there was an environmental change, maybe the tree grew taller. Well, which giraffes are going to have the best chance of surviving and overcome the struggle for existence? Well, again, it's going to be the taller giraffes. So the taller giraffes are going to have this evolutionary advantage. So the giraffes with longer necks have an advantage. They could reach the leaves the other giraffes could not, and therefore the long-necked giraffes were more likely to survive and reproduce. When we're thinking about the term fitness, the taller giraffes have the greater fitness compared to the shorter giraffes. Now, if we look at this, these giraffes passed the long neck trait to their offspring. Each generation, the population contained more long-necked giraffes, and eventually all the giraffes had long necks. So this mutation that occurred in our first scenario, well, that gave these individual giraffes, the taller giraffes, an evolutionary advantage. And because they had an evolutionary advantage, that mutation continues to get passed on through the lineage, and eventually we get giraffes with just long necks because they have greater fitness. So the result of the evolution, or the result of this scenario, well, as a result, only the giraffes with the mutation or longer than average neck will survive. Offspring of these individuals will also result in long necks. So we can see that the mutations were continued and passed along, and this eventually leads to the proliferation of these giraffes with this long neck morphology that we see in the modern world and in modern Animalia here. So the increase in neck length is potentially based on the environment, but it's based on this mutation that has occurred and the overall fitness of those individuals. Now, the increase in neck length can be based on the environment, but as we think about this a little bit more, it's based on fitness. The taller giraffes have an evolutionary advantage. They are more fit compared to the shorter neck giraffes, so therefore they are going to survive, and the shorter giraffes will not survive. Okay, so how did the giraffes actually get taller then? How are they going through and evolving? So there's going to be a couple of things that we have to understand here, and the best way to go through and look at this is looking at a graph. So on our x-axis we have the height, and on our y-axis we have the number of giraffes. Now this bell curve here is going to represent the average height for generation 1. Now if we're thinking about the term fitness, we want to think about the giraffes that can go through and are going to be able to reproduce the best. Well, the ones that are going to reproduce the best are going to be the ones with the longest necks. So if we're looking at this, in the first generation, all of the individuals in the pink here on this bell curve are going to reproduce, and they are going to go through and pass their genes on to the next generation. Now, all of the individuals in the yellow are not going to be as fit. Therefore, they are not going to reproduce, and they are not going to pass on their genes to the next generation. So now if we take the average and we look at all of the giraffes for generation 2, what we see is we're going to see a shift in the mean height of those giraffes. And those giraffes' heights have shifted because the smaller giraffes and the genes contained within that subset of that population did not get passed on to the second generation. If we go to the third generation, again, the taller these individuals get, the better fit they are for their environment, and the easier it becomes to pass on their genes. They are more fit. So what we see is if we were looking at the first generation, well, the mean height was here. And then if we look at the second generation, well, now the mean height is here. So our height and the length of the necks has shifted to a taller group of individuals over successive generations. Now, looking at these graphs, there's two key things that we have to understand. Evolution does not occur at the individual level. Individuals do not evolve. It occurs over generations. The second thing that we have to go through and understand here is that the individuals who had longer necks were more fit, therefore they could pass their genes on. They had the ability to reproduce because they were more fit for that environment. So evolution is occurring over successive generations and over long periods of time. And we have to understand that this is a long-term process. And as we look at giraffes and the environment, we can see that this mutation and this evolutionary advantage and the morphology of the long neck has been passed down from generation to generation, and slowly over time these giraffes have gained long necks. Alright, so did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys go through and think about Charles Darwin's thought process when developing the idea of evolution? Did you guys go through and just have a basic understanding of some of the people who influenced him? Did you guys go through and learn about the basics of natural selection? And then did you learn a little bit about some of the giraffes and how they gained longer necks? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.